With us here today to speak about this issue of religion and dominion versus compassion for animals is Frank Hoffman, founder of All Creatures. Welcome, Frank. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Lori. Glad to be here.
Frank, am I correct in my impression that organized religion, Judeo-Christian faith specifically, are simply not engaged in the discussion of animal welfare?
A few are, but for the vast majority, no. And there's a tremendous indifference that is existing throughout. In fact, I think it's throughout all of world religions, not just Judeo-Christian. Animals seem to be somewhere off in Never Never Land. They don't consider them as living souls like the Bible teaches us they are. Every single animal and humans were created as living souls, the Hebrew nefesh hayah. And if they are living souls as we are, then whatever happens to humans spiritually happens to the animals because we're the same. Mm-hmm. And religion denies that for the most part. Some religions accept that, but others don't. A Judeo-Christian sort of holds back on it, and yet the Bible describes animals in heaven too. So there seems to be this dichotomy, inconsistency, whatever it is you want to call it.
Why should organized religion be interested in the lives of animals? One might think, Frank, that things that are important in religious life just do not intersect much with the animal concerns.
That's not true. They absolutely do intersect. The big problem is that we fail to understand God's intent. If we look at the beginning of the Bible, and I'm going to talk mostly from a Judeo-Christian standpoint, if we look at the beginning of the Bible, there is this beautiful paradise created called Eden. And within Eden, there is no death, there's no suffering, until the point of Adam and Eve disobeying God. And when that occurs, we end up with the fall. And we have the sin and other things coming into this world. Now, if we take and stop there for a minute, and we go to the end of the Bible in the Christian religion, we have the book of Revelation, which tells us near the end of the book that there's no death or suffering or pain or mourning in heaven. So we're sitting here saying that's God's intent because we see it in the beginning and the end. God even says, I'm Alpha and Omega. If we look in the middle of the Bible in Isaiah's prophecy, we see this peaceable kingdom being described. And that peaceable kingdom says that all humans and animals will live together and they will not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Well, turn that statement around a little bit, and it says that the problem or the reason that we don't have this peace on earth is because we lack the knowledge of God. And I think that's the major problem with religion, that we lack this spiritual knowledge of God's intent. And when Jesus came, he says, among other things, he in the Beatitudes, which, by the way, tells us, people say, bless me, and yet they don't do the things that the Beatitudes tells us to do if we want to be blessed by God. But in one of those, he says, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. They shall be considered sons of God, it says, but it means children of God. If we then go a little bit further in that same chapter, chapter 5 of Matthew, it says, God says to us, or Jesus says to us, he says, you shall be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Well, we just found out that in heaven there was no death, no suffering. And then Jesus teaches us to pray, and he says, thy kingdom come. This way you're supposed to pray. Our Father who art in heaven, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Well, let's just stay with that second part of that we are to pray for God's heavenly will to be done here on earth as it is in heaven. Well, that means if we're praying for it, then we should do everything in our power to eliminate death on earth. It's quite simple to me. Mm-hmm. I don't see any disconnect there. And yet, that's where the disconnect occurs. They say, well, it can't apply to animals. And they go to Aristotle, and they go to Descartes, and they go to everything outside of Christ and God and the Holy Spirit, and they create this hijacked religion based on cruelty and suffering, which it's not. It's not supposed to be.
Frank, how much of the current thinking about the role of animals in our society is based on ancient writings and beliefs?
I would say all of it.
All of it.
It's based upon secular thinking, not religious, but secular. In the beginning, we started off as vegans, eating no animal products whatsoever. We have, in the beginning of Christianity, a great number of the Jewish Christians were vegan, or at least vegetarian.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, that caused a lot of dissension when Paul started to speak to the Gentiles, because what he did there was he told them not to pay any attention to the dietary laws. What we're looking at is saving your souls, and they were sacrificing animals to idols. And he says there's no such thing as an idol. It's just a made-up God. And he was saying, don't worry about it. I want you to start recognizing who God is. Not saying that it's okay to eat meat, though some people misinterpret that. But one thing Paul did say, and this is important to come back to what we were just talking about before, because what he says in chapter 8 of the book of Romans, he says that these sons and daughters of God, these children of God, who are the peacemakers, will also free the whole of creation from the corruption for which it's been subjected today. In other words, it's moaning and groaning and suffering until the revealing of the sons and daughters of God. So we're back to the same point, that we're not living the way we're called to live.
Okay, we're speaking with Frank Hoffman with all-creatures.org. And in the second part of our three-part discussion, we talk about the concept of dominion. And specifically, I ask Frank if the Bible states that we humans are free to do whatever we want to the animals. Frank will make the argument that the Bible clearly states dominion is stewardship, to care for God's creation. And it's our job to protect creation and stop any suffering that comes upon the animals. And furthermore, we should all be vegetarian. And that indeed was God's intention because of the cruelty inherent in factory farming. Finally, we talk about children and how we are hardening the hearts of our children and leading them astray. Take a listen.
Frank, talk about then the concept of dominion. God tells Adam and Eve to have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the fowl of the air and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. Frank, doesn't that mean that man is free to do what he wants with the animals?
No, absolutely not, because you can't stop there. You even have to go to not to the end of the chapter, but you have to go to the end of the paragraph.
Mm-hmm.
And if you read on a little bit, he says that, it's up through verse 31, he says that every animal and every human shall eat plants. There's no reference to eating any other living being. And then he looks back upon everything that he had made, including giving dominion to humans and this vegan diet, and he says it's very good. So when you look at that, you cannot accept the fact or the interpretation that dominion is anything other than stewardship, to care for my creation.
Right.
And that's what it means. It means to stop the suffering. You're to stand in the gap and protect creation from any force of evil that comes upon it.
Right. So the concept of dominion is not really domination over, but really stewardship with.
That's correct.
And Frank, frequently one hears, oh, God created the animals for us to eat.
Yeah, if God didn't intend us to eat meat, he wouldn't have made animals out of meat. That's
right.
facetious. It's those kind of things are trying to justify the evil. God gave us a concession. He gave evil human beings a concession. And if somebody doesn't believe that he gave evil human beings a concession, then all they have to do is look at the end of the flood in chapter 8 of Genesis, where Noah makes a sacrifice. And while God accepts his sin offering, he says, but man is evil from his youth. And he's saying, because you killed the animals, because you didn't accept my grace, I can't do anymore. I'm not going to destroy the earth again. I'm just going to let you live in your evil ways. And he gives a concession for them to eat meat. A concession, not his order, not his law.
So
it's the concession.
People are misinterpreting his wishes there.
That's correct. And one other thing he did, he took away the covenant relationship, because he says from now on animals will have the fear of you, which means prior to this time they didn't have a fear of man. So we were looking at this, and the next part says, you shall not eat an animal with its blood, with its life. You know, and you look at a piece of meat, there's this red fluid that flows out. People try to swallow, but some of that's red blood cells. So there is some blood left in the meat. You can't get it all out. And no matter whether, you know, they say kosher law, you salt the meat, you do this, you do that, it doesn't make any difference. There's still some blood left in. And if we look, every single chronic disease that we have in this world today, all the viral infections have an origin in animal agriculture or in eating animals.
Frank, Jesus said that God feeds the birds of the air and does not forget the sparrows. Does that imply that people should behave in a certain way towards the animals?
We should be doing the same thing.
Right.
But we have to understand in the context it's given all the time.
Mm-hmm.
You have to look at that. But it doesn't just stop there. Yes, God supplies everything in his creation, and we're not supposed to take it away.
How about the prophecy of Isaiah that at the end of time, all creatures again will be vegetarian? Does that tell us something like we should be vegetarians now?
Oh, absolutely.
Right. And why?
Because that is, in my opinion, that's what this is saying, is that that's part of having the knowledge of the Lord. Because we do not create any problems. We don't create any hardness of heart, which, going back to, trying to tie this together a little bit from what you had asked before in our first session, is that if we look at the source of the problem, and I believe the source of the problem is what we do to animals, and we start with our children when they're very young. And because the number of hunters are falling out, they're even trying to lower the hunting age in many states. And what we're looking at here is that we're hardening the hearts of our children. And the Bible teaches us, if we go back, and I'm going back to the Hebrew text, that it would be better for that person, and Jesus says the same thing, it would be better for that person who does something against these little ones, that a millstone be hung around their neck and they be drowned in the depths of the sea. Because they're leading children astray. That's what we're doing in this country. We're hardening the hearts. If you take a look at most little children, they love these little plush animals. They stroke the fur, and they love an animal that is a docile one, and they'll pet it, and they just want to be near them. There's this sensitivity, and then something begins to happen as they get a little older because they're being told to eat their meat. And sooner or later, they begin to realize that that's an animal. And some of them will rebel at that point against the teaching and don't want to eat animals anymore. They're told to drink their milk, and the cows suffer horribly. And the whole society we live in promotes it. You can't turn on television without them telling us how wonderful it is to eat the tortured remains of some animal. And we're coming up in a few days to Thanksgiving, and we're going to have the same thing where people are going to give thanks for the tortured remains of a once living, breathing, loving, caring bird.
Makes no sense.
Doesn't make sense at all.
I'm speaking here with Frank Hoffman with all-creatures.org. And in this last part of the interview, Frank makes the argument that everything we are doing is to try to justify the killing and eating of animals. And people are living in the concessions and not in the will of God. Frank goes on to explain how factory farming violates Christian principles and how you can help our animal friends. And then finally, I ask Frank what the Bible says about activities like sport hunting, in which we take pleasure in the suffering of other living beings. Here you go.
Now, if you try to make the argument, Frank, to an observant Jew that there is a biblical guidance from the Torah for being a vegetarian or not eating meat, they are going to respond that there's a whole tradition of kosher practice with rules and important rituals and objects to use in the rituals, including the slaughter of animals for consumption. That's a lot to overcome unless the person is inclined to be a vegetarian or even considering the suffering of animals?
Well, I think it's a little deeper than that. Let's go back to the child situation and living in the concessions rather than the will of God. It's not the will of God. They take that Isaiah prophecy, which you mentioned, and say, well, that's sometime in the future. Well, it's for the here and now as well, because that was God's intent. So everything they're doing is trying to justify the killing and eating of animals. And if, I don't know if you saw it or not, there was this video, it's undercover video of the kosher killing of animals. And it shows the just unbelievable, horrible way the animals are being killed.
Yeah.
And it's nothing like what they're supposed to be.
Right.
And the rabbi that was there, the sheikh, was just turning his back on the suffering of the animals because his heart became as hard of heart.
Yeah, and the Hebrew Scriptures forbid inhumane slaughter or cruelty toward beasts of burden, and yet there's all this horrific cruelty the animals endure up until that instant the blade slits the animal's throat, which is killed in a kosher way.
And that's right. And there's the passage from Proverbs where it says the righteous man has regard for the life of his animal, but the compassion of the wicked is cruel. And I think that's what you're referring to. So what we're saying is that what they're doing is really wicked.
And if they knew what God's intentions were, would they still do it?
Well, see, that's the point, but nobody is teaching it.
That's right. So
that's the big problem
right.
that we have. They're not teaching the difference. And this is one of the reasons I resigned as a pastor. I just couldn't do it anymore in the church because there were too many restrictions. So that's when we started our foundation and all-creatures.org, because we've been doing this now for 11 years. And it's because we couldn't get the message out to a lot of different people. Probably in the last 10 years of my church ministry, maybe I had a chance to speak to 1,000 different people. Today on the Internet, we'll talk to 15,000 in one day, maybe more, maybe 20.
So, Frank, are there any mainstream physical churches or temples that teach lessons of compassion toward animals?
There are a few. We have a few listed on our website, and I mean they're few, and they're far between.
Having compassion for animals versus domination over animals and various religious teachings. We are speaking with Frank Hoffman. Frank, have you tried to get church leaders or Jewish leaders interested in animal welfare?
Yes, I did. And I've been working on it for a number of years. We've been doing this for probably close to a quarter century.
You're really going grassroots here to the faithful church members or temple members who respect and love animals, and you encourage them to influence their religious leaders, correct?
That's correct. And we're doing that all over the world. We have quite a following in Australia, New Zealand, England. The only place we don't have any direct contact is in Antarctica. Everything, we're in all the other continents.
So what can interested people do?
The main thing is talk about their compassion. Don't hide it. Be vegan. Set the example before others. Tell people why you aren't eating meat or wearing animal clothing. Explain it. Don't be afraid. Don't be arrogant about it, but be polite, be friendly, but let people understand where you're coming from. And don't participate in the things that promote animal cruelty. If we look at the problems we have today, the vast majority of grains that we produce go to fatten animals. And the efficiency by calorie for calorie, if we took the grain and fed it to humans, would feed anywhere from 3 to 15 times as many people. We would not have any hunger in this world. The UN Agriculture Committee came out and said that 18% of all greenhouse gases are coming from animal agriculture. So if we take a look at, and that's mostly methane, which is 20-some times more toxic than carbon dioxide, if we take this and we're saying, okay, if we're vegan, we're not only being compassionate to the animals, we're being compassionate to other people, because we're now being able to feed more people, and we're protecting the environment in which we all live. So it just ties together. And if we really want to make a difference in this world, it's not changing the light bulb to one of these fluorescents from an incandescent. That's like taking an eyedropper to bail the ocean out. When we stop eating animals, we're making a tremendous difference in this world.
this is a point that many environmentalists just don't want to discuss, and that is the damage that factory farming does to our planet.
Yeah.
Frank,
food is by far, I mean, we're killing around the world every year 50 billion land animals, 10 billion in this country alone. And that's not counting the billions upon billions upon billions of sea creatures that are being killed. It's absolutely innumerable. You can't even count the number of animals that are being killed in the sea.
Does factory farming violate Christian principles?
Absolutely. You're torturing an animal for money. And there's no question that it's torture.
So how can a religious person justify this?
Well, that's the point. They shouldn't be justifying it.
Right.
And yet, there's churches that hold turkey dinners. Today, we probably minister to about 1 million people around the world, most of whom are unchurched, which is a very interesting thing to understand because they get so hurt because they get ridiculed and made fun of in the churches that they leave the church. They just won't stay there, but they're still religious. It's because of the hardness of heart they see. You're never supposed to belittle somebody because they don't eat an animal, and yet that's what's happening. And I know more people who have left religion because of the lack of compassion, because of the hardness of heart they've encountered, than for any other reason at all. It rarely has its foundation as I just don't believe. What the answer is, I just can't believe the way these people act, and that's really where it's coming down to. I can't associate what I thought God was like with the cruelty and the indifference and the injustice and everything that's going on in the religious community. And it's what they're doing is they're in essence blaming God for the human frailty, indifference, injustice, and cruelty, outright cruelty.
When it's our doing.
Yes, when it's our doing. They have empathy for humans, but not for animals.
Yeah.
They lack empathy for animals. Yeah. We take a look at our society. Parents, what are they doing? They have empathy for their child. They have empathy for their dog or cat, but not for the other animals. If somebody is truly compassionate, we wouldn't torture and kill the animals. We would realize how wrong it is.
Frank, what does the Bible say about sport hunting?
Just remember the term sport is saying that you take pleasure in.
Right.
And you're not supposed to take pleasure in the suffering of any other living being.
And to teach their children it's okay that you can be entertained and get enjoyment out of going out and looking a deer in the face and killing that animal.
That's correct. And that, comes from hardening the heart. They lose their empathy.
Frank Hoffman, thank you so much for being with us on Animals Today. Frank's website, which is a must to check out, is www.all-creatures.org. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you. Love to come back.